Welcome back, family, to another episode of the Melanin Wellness Podcast. We are deep into our Medicine in Black series. I'm your host, Corey, and today we're diving into a deep but necessary conversation, the colonization of herbalism. Herbalism isn't just about plants. It's about culture, power, and history. And if we're talking about herbalism today, we need to acknowledge how systemic racism shaped the way we understand and access these healing traditions. Because let's be real, modern Western herbalism didn't just evolve on its own. It was deeply influenced by the knowledge of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples. Yet those contributions have been erased, exploited, and outright stolen. So let's talk about it. How did African and indigenous healing traditions influence Western medicine? How did colonizers both fear and rely on the herbal wisdom for enslaved Africans? And why is it so important to reclaim and honor these roots today? Grab your tea, settle in, and let's get into it. First, let's set the stage. Before colonization, African herbalism was already incredibly advanced. Many of our ancestors came from regions with rich medicinal practices, from the healing temples of ancient Egypt to the deep plant knowledge of West and Central Africa. When enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas, they didn't just bring their bodies, they carried their knowledge, their spiritual practices, and in some cases, even the seeds of their homeland braided into their hair. But here's the thing. The plants in the Americas were different from those in Africa. So what did our ancestors do? They adapted. They learned from the indigenous peoples who had their own deep-rooted herbal knowledge. This cultural exchange was essential for survival. Indigenous healers shared wisdom about local plants, while enslaved Africans introduced their own knowledge of root medicine and spiritual healing. And together, these communities shaped what we now recognize as American herbalism. But of course, this didn't happen without interference. Now, this is where things get messy. European colonizers saw the power of African herbal knowledge and they wanted it. When European medicine failed, or when it became too expensive to import remedies from overseas, colonizers turned to the very people they enslaved for healing. They sought out enslaved herbalists for everything from fever remedies to wound care. But here's the catch. While they needed this knowledge, they also feared this knowledge. They knew that herbalism wasn't just about healing, it was about power. Enslaved Africans could use plants for resistance, whether it was to treat illness, induce miscarriages to prevent forced pregnancies, or even poison those who oppressed them. That fear led to harsh restrictions. In some colonies, enslaved people were banned from practicing medicine altogether. In others, laws were passed requiring enslaved healers to get approval from a white overseer before treating anyone. Because to enslavers, the idea of Black people controlling their own health, let alone the health of others, was a threat. One of the most extreme examples of this fear was in the 18th and 19th centuries, when laws were passed to criminalize Black herbalism. In Virginia, for example, there were laws that made it punishable by death for an enslaved person to administer medicine without permission. Imagine that, being killed for healing your own people. But let's not get it twisted. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. Colonizers knew that herbal knowledge gave enslaved Africans a certain level of autonomy, and they wanted to take that away. Yet, despite these restrictions, our ancestors found ways to preserve their knowledge. Some healing practices were passed down in secret, hidden in songs, stories, and rituals. Others survived through the wisdom of midwives, root workers, and herbalists who continued their work despite the dangers. And here's the final layer to this story. After centuries of erasing and criminalizing Black herbalism, much of that knowledge was later co-opted by Western medicine. Many remedies that were once labeled as superstition, when practiced by enslaved Africans, suddenly became legitimate medicine once white doctors and botanists started to use them. Remember, we were often accused of voodoo in our healing practices. Take quinine, for example. It was widely used in West Africa to treat malaria long before Europeans, quote unquote, discovered it. Or even the use of castor oil and other plant-based laxatives, which were originally African remedies. Yet even today, Black herbalists and healers are often overlooked in the mainstream wellness space. Our traditions have been borrowed from, but rarely credited. So, what does all this mean for us today, you may wonder? It means that reclaiming our herbal traditions is an act of resistance, especially in this here 2025. When we learn about the herbs our ancestors use, when we incorporate these remedies into our wellness routines, when we support Black herbalists and healers, we are honoring the wisdom that was meant to be erased. Herbalism isn't just about plants, it's about history, our history, resilience, our ancestors' resilience, and community. It's about reconnecting with the knowledge that kept our ancestors alive, even under the most brutal conditions. So, as herbalism continues to grow in popularity, let's make sure that we're not just participating in it, but also giving credit where credit is due. Let's uplift Black herbalists, study our history, and pass this wisdom down so that future generations know the truth. That's it for today's episode of the Melanin Wellness Podcast, Medicine in Black series. If this conversation resonated with you, please share this podcast. Leave it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And follow along for more deep dives into our ancestral healing traditions. This will be going on all month long. And if you're ready to start incorporating more herbal wisdom in your own life, drop me a leaf in the comments and let me know what healing traditions have been passed down in your family. And I'd love to share mine with you. Until next time, family, stay rooted, stay resilient, and keep reclaiming our history.